Imagine a ship heavy with gold, silver, ivory, and rum treasures, looted from the veins of empires and the sweat of slaves. A ship that began its life in chains, built to carry human cargo across the Atlantic in the horror of the Middle Passage, only to be stolen by pirates and transformed into the richest prize of the Golden Age. That ship was the Whydah Gally. But the Whydah was no ordinary vessel. Under the black flag of Captain Samuel "Black Sam" Bellamy, she became a floating fortress, her belly swollen with plunder, her decks swarming with desperate men who would abandon the world of laws and kings for the promise of freedom and unimaginable wealth. For a brief moment, she ruled the Atlantic, a legend whispered in taverns from Boston to Barbados, and then, in one terrible night, it all ended. Off the storm-lashed coast of Cape Cod in April 1717, the Whydah struck a sandbar. The sea rose with fury. Cannons tore free, treasure spilled, and men screamed as the ship splintered. In less than an hour, the Whydah and all but 2 of her crew were swallowed by the waves. Along with her went the largest pirate treasure ever lost to the deep. For centuries, the wreck lay buried beneath sand and storm, whispered of as a cursed fortune, a ghost ship that had carried both suffering and freedom, gold and blood. Divers dreamed, scholars argued, legends grew, and then one day it was found. But what they uncovered beneath the waves was stranger, darker and more human than any tale of gold doubloons or cursed jewels. Because the Whydah is not just a story of treasure, it's a story of empire, rebellion, greed, and ghosts that refuse to rest. And it begins in Africa, under a merciless sun, where the Whydah first set sail not as a pirate ship, but as a slaver. The Whydah Gally was born in 1715, not in glory but in horror. She was built in London, sleek and powerful, her timbers fresh cut and her sails strong, designed for speed and cargo. But her purpose was not noble trade. She was a slaver, a ship crafted to carry hundreds of chained men, women, and children across the Atlantic, from Africa to the sugar islands of the New World. Her name came from Whydah to the Englisher, brutal slave port on the West African coast. There, under the burning sun, European traders struck deals with African kings and warlords, exchanging muskets, rum, and cloth for human lives. The Whydah was designed to make that journey efficiently, with holds modified not for goods, but for human flesh. In her maiden voyages, the Whydah was filled with screams. Men shackled in chains, forced below decks where the air grew foul and dark. Children cried for mothers they would never see again. The lash-cracked guards shouted, and the ship surged across the waves with misery in her belly. She was fast, and she was profitable. Her owners grew rich, their pockets heavy with the blood gold of slavery. The Whydah made run after run, her timbers groaning, her decks slick with sweat and filth. She was a floating tomb, carrying death as much as profit. But the sea has a way of reshaping destinies. In February 1717, the Whydah, commanded by a Captain Lawrence Prince, was sailing from Jamaica to England, her hold crammed with treasure, gold, silver, indigo, ivory, and rum. She had completed a run of the triangular trade, and now she was heavy with profit. It was then that fate brought her into the path of a man who would change her forever. Samuel Bellamy, Black Sam, as sailors called him, was a pirate of charisma and daring. He was young only, in his 20s, but already notorious, with dark hair that blew wild in the wind, and a reputation for both ferocity and fairness. His ship, the Sultana, prowled the Caribbean with a fleet of captured vessels. Bellamy had once been a poor sailor, a man with little to his name but ambition. Now he was building an empire at sea. When Bellamy spotted the Whydah, he saw more than a prize. He saw destiny. The Whydah was fast, but Bellamy was relentless. The chase lasted hours, sails straining, cannon crews waiting. At last, outgunned and outmanned, Captain Prince surrendered. The Whydah was his no more. Bellamy stepped aboard, his boots striking the deck of the slave ship turned treasure galleon. He looked around at the fine lines of her hull, the gleam of her cannons, the piles of plunder in her hold. A smile curled his lips. "She do," he said simply. The Whydah was his flagship now. For the men who sailed with him, the capture was like being reborn. They were pirates, men who had deserted naval service or fled the lash of merchant captains, men who had chosen freedom under the black flag. On the Whydah they found a floating kingdom. Her decks swarmed with laughter and song. Her masts flew the skull and crossbones. Her hold grew heavier with each raid. Bellamy himself became a legend. He dressed not in gaudy silks, but in simple black, his charisma binding his men as firmly as chains once bound the slaves the Whydah had carried. He was called the Robin Hood of the sea, for he sometimes spared poor sailors and targeted the rich. When he spoke, his men listened. When he fought, they followed without hesitation. Yet beneath the songs and the swagger, the Whydah carried ghosts. Sailors whispered of screams heard in the night, of chains rattling below decks where none now lay, of shadows moving in the dark. She had been a slaver, and though Bellamy had filled her with plunder, her past could not be scrubbed away. Still, Bellamy pressed on. The Whydah became the most feared pirate ship in the Atlantic, her reputation spreading like wildfire. Every merchant feared her sails on the horizon. Every governor cursed her name, but even legends fall. The spring of 1717 brought storms to the New England coast. Bellamy, flush with treasure, turned north, intending to plunder further, and perhaps even return to his love. Maria Hallett, the woman he had promised to marry before he set to sea. The Whydah was heavy now, too heavy with chests of coin, bars of gold, crates of jewels. She rode low in the water, her speed slowed, her agility compromised. As April winds howled, the Whydah sailed into waters she could not master, and there, off Cape Cod, destiny waited in the form of a sandbar and a storm. The night of April 26th, 1717, the storm rose. Winds screamed, waves towered. The Whydah struggled, her sails tearing, her timbers groaning. At midnight she struck the bar. Cannons tore free and crashed through the deck. Treasure spilled as the ship broke apart. Men screamed as they were hurled into black waves. Bellamy himself, the Robin Hood of the sea, was swallowed by the ocean. Over 140 men perished, only to survive dragged ashore by waves. Clinging to wreckage, the Whydah was gone, her treasure buried beneath sand and surf. But her story was not finished, because the sea does not keep secrets forever. The Whydah Gally, once the iron heart of the slave trade, had been remade. Her chains were struck, her holds emptied of misery, her decks now alive with laughter, rum, and the sharp tang of gunpowder. Samuel Black, Sam Bellamy, the poor English sailor turned pirate lord, stood at her helm, black hair whipping in the wind, his simple clothes marked not by jewels but by purpose. To his men, he was not just a captain, he was a king, and the Whydah was his throne. The capture of the Whydah in February, 1717 had been more than a victory, it was transformation. Bellamy had taken a vessel built to enslave and made her a symbol of rebellion. Her sleek hull now bore the black flag, her broadside bristled with 28 cannons, and her decks teemed with over 150 men of every nation, creed, and class. Sailors from Britain and Ireland, escaped slaves from the Caribbean, native men, freed Africans, and desperate outlaws all called her home. They were bound not by chains or crowns, but by an oath to the sea and to each other. Life aboard the Whydah was unlike any naval deck in the world. In the Royal Navy, men were beaten for hesitation, flogged for defiance, and starved on thin rations, while officers dined on meat and wine. On the Whydah, loot was shared according to pirate code. Every man, from the gunners to the captain, took his portion. Disputes were settled by vote, punishments decided by council. Even Bellamy himself received but a double share, far less than the fortune naval officers claimed from the labor of their men. To those who had known only tyranny, it was intoxicating. But the Whydah was not all liberty and laughter. She was a war machine, and Bellamy meant to wield her with precision. Each dawn, drills rattled the deck's cannons rolled into place. Muskets loaded, cutlasses sharpened until they gleamed like fangs in the sun. Bellamy drove his men hard, not with lashes but with speeches, urging them to remember why they had chosen the black flag. "We are not thieves," he once thundered, his voice carrying across the salt-slick planks. "We are avengers. Kings grow fat while we starve. Merchants profit while we bleed. We take what was stolen from us." The men roared, their fists pounding the rail, and take they did. The Whydah cut a swath up the American coast, her sails striking terror in merchants' hearts. In March, she cornered a ship from Madeira laden with wine. The crew surrendered without a fight, and by dusk, casks were rolled onto the Whydah's deck, the pirates drunk and singing shanties until the sea itself seemed to sway with them. Days later, a vessel from Jamaica, laden with indigo and sugar, fell to her guns. Each capture swelled their stores, until the Whydah rode low in the water, her hold groaning with wealth. But Bellamy's reputation was built not just on victory, but on his strange code of honor. Unlike many pirates, he rarely killed surrendered crews. He mocked the wealthy but spared the poor, sometimes even gifting struggling sailors coin or supplies before sending them on their way. "They hate us," he told his quartermaster, "because we do not bow. Better then that they also envy us." To common men, his name became a secret kind of hope. To governors, it was a curse spat into the wind. Yet the Whydah carried shadows with her. In quiet nights, when the sea was calm and the crew slept, men whispered of the screams that sometimes drifted from the hold echoes of her slave ship past. Some claimed they saw chains clinking in the dark, or heard the weeping of women when no women were aboard. One night, a lookout swore he saw a pale figure standing on the deck, wrists shackled, eyes hollow. By morning, the man had gone mad, mumbling of ghosts until Bellamy ordered him ashore. The Whydah was cursed, the men muttered, but she was also blessed with fortune. And so they sailed on, laughing through the fear, their pockets heavy with gold. By April, Bellamy commanded not just the Whydah, but an entire fleet. Captured sloops and brigs swelled his power, and his men numbered over 200. He was no longer a mere raider, he was a warlord of the sea. His sights turned north, toward New England, where rumors whispered of rich ships fat with goods bound for England. But Bellamy had another reason, too, more private, more human. In Cape Cod there was a woman, Maria Hallett, whom he had loved before turning pirate. Some said she had waited for him, others that she had been cast out by her community, branded a witch for her affair with a pirate. Bellamy, it was said, meant to return to her in triumph, his pockets full of gold, ready to claim the life denied him by birth. The crew spoke of it in hushed tones. "Our captain wants his bride," one sailor chuckled, rolling dice on the deck. Another spat over the rail. "Bride or no, we'll be rich. Let him chase his last, we'll drink Madeira till our guts burst." But the sea is a jealous mistress. On April 26, 1717, as the fleet neared Cape Cod, the weather shifted. The air thickened, the wind howled strange. Bellamy stood at the helm, staring at clouds boiling over the horizon. "Storm," he muttered, though his voice carried a note of unease. The Whydah was heavy now, too heavy with plunder, her hull riding low, her sails sluggish. Her fortune, so bright, was beginning to drag her down that night. As rain slashed the decks and lightning split the sky, Bellamy's fleet scattered. The Whydah pressed forward, her cannons lashed, her treasure chained. Waves rose like mountains, crashing over the bow. Men screamed as water flooded the hold. Bellamy shouted orders, his hair plastered to his face, his voice barely heard over the roar. "Hold fast. She'll see us through." But the Whydah was no longer the swift slave ship she had been built to be. She was a bloated queen, her belly swollen with greed. And the sandbars of Cape Cod waited in the dark dotted midnight. With a sound like the world tearing, the Whydah struck. Her keel ripped across sand. Her masts shuddered, and the sea poured in. Cannons tore loose, smashing men into pulp. Treasure chests burst, coins scattering like rain. Lightning illuminated chaos men clinging to ropes, cutlasses flashing, bodies hurled into black water. Bellamy himself, shouting above the storm, was seen one moment on deck, the next swallowed by a wave. The Whydah broke apart in less than an hour. Over 140 men went down with her, their cries drowned in thunder. Only 2 crawled ashore, half dead, clutching driftwood. The richest pirate ship in history had vanished into the sea, her hoard buried under sand and surf. But the story did not end there, because the Whydah did not simply vanish. She lingered. Her wreck became legend, her treasure whispered of in every port. For centuries, treasure hunters sought her, lured by dreams of gold and haunted by tales of curses. And beneath the waves, her timbers slept, her cannons buried, her coins scattered like bones, waiting. When the storm of April 1717 subsided, the beaches of Cape Cod were littered with horror. Splintered planks, shattered cannons, and the swollen bodies of drowned men washed ashore. The people of Wellfleet awoke to find their coasts transformed into a graveyard. Among the wreckage were coins glittering in the sand, jewels tangled in seaweed, and ivory tusks rolling in the surf like bones from the deep. But more ghastly than treasure were the corpses pirates tangled together, eyes blank, faces still twisted in their final terror. Women wept as they turned bodies with sticks, searching for missing husbands, while children crept forward to pluck coins from the dead men's pockets. The Whydah, the richest pirate ship in history, was gone. Her captain, Black Sam Bellamy, was gone. All but 2 of her crew were gone, and yet the whispers began almost at once. Fishermen spoke of seeing lights on the horizon, lanterns bobbing where no ships sailed. Hunters in the dunes swore they heard voices carried on the wind, men shouting in accents foreign and long dead. The Puritan ministers of New England thundered from pulpits that the wreck was God's judgment upon sinners. proof that pirates reaped damnation as surely as they sowed it. But in the taverns, in the secret corners of docks and markets, the story twisted. Perhaps the treasure had survived, buried just beneath the sand, waiting for bold hands to claim it. The two survivors of the wreck were dragged in chains to Boston and hanged, their testimony fanning the legend. They told of chests of silver, gold doubloons by the sackful, and jewels enough to ransom a king, all aboard when the Whydah went down. A fortune lies beneath your waters, one declared at the gallows, just before the rope snapped his neck. That single sentence burned into the imagination of New England. For years after, men combed the beaches, digging pits in the dunes, sifting sand with bleeding fingers. Sometimes they found a coin or two, green with corrosion. Sometimes a rusted pistol or a fragment of chain, but the great hoard remained elusive. The sea had swallowed it whole. As decades passed, the Whydah became more myth than memory. Her story was told in whispers around hearth fires, in ballads sung by sailors, in nightmares where the drowned clawed at dreamers from beneath the waves. Children dared each other to walk the beaches at night, listening for the creak of ghostly timbers or the rattle of shackles on the wind. Some claimed they had seen Bellamy himself, striding the shore in dripping clothes, his hair streaming with seawater, his eyes black as the storm that had claimed him by the 19th century. The Whydah's legend had grown monstrous. Treasure hunters arrived from distant states, bringing spades and shovels, driven by rumors of gold still buried. Some dug so deep in the dunes that houses collapsed into pits, swallowed by their obsession. But still, the treasure eluded them. It was as if the sea itself guarded Bellamy's fortune, covering it with shifting sands and storms whenever hands came too close. Locals muttered that the wreck was cursed, that the ghosts of the drowned crew would never allow their gold to be stolen. Fishermen who tried to dive in search of the wreck often never returned, their boats found drifting empty, their bodies washing up days later. Yet the Whydah refused to fade. Her name clung to Cape Cod like sea mist. In the libraries of Boston, scholars traced her story, piecing together records of the trial, the hangings, the cargo manifests. Writers romanticized Bellamy as the Robin Hood of the sea, and Maria Hallett, the woman he had loved, was recast as the Witch of Wellfleet, cursed to wander the dunes, searching for her pirate lover. Legend said she had lit a lantern on the stormy night of the wreck, hoping to guide him home, but instead luring him to destruction on the sandbar. For generations, lovers walked the shore at night, claiming to hear her voice weeping in the wind. The Whydah became not just a wreck, but a haunting a story too strange, too heavy with tragedy, to rest easy. She was a symbol of greed and freedom, of love and ruin, of riches gained and lost in a single night. And still, beneath the waves, she waited. It would take more than 2 centuries before anyone found her. In the 1980s, a man named Barry Clifford became obsessed with the legend, a treasure hunter from Massachusetts. Clifford had grown up with the tales of the Whydah on Cape Cod's beaches, listening to old fishermen mutter about the lost pirate fortune. To most, the story was just that, a story. But to Clifford, it was a challenge. He believed the wreck was real and that it could be found. Armed with modern diving equipment, sonar and sheer determination, Clifford and his team began searching the waters off Wellfleet. Locals laughed. Scholars sneered. The Whydah is gone, they said, swallowed forever. But Clifford pressed on. Day after day, his crew scanned the ocean floor, braving storms and currents, studying maps and records. And then, in 1984, the sea finally gave up her secret at a depth of only 14 feet. Buried under centuries of shifting sand, they found her timbers blackened by time, cannons crusted with coral, and coins by the handful, scattered across the seabed like stars in the dark. Clifford had found the Whydah Gally. It was not just a treasure, it was history. For the first time, a pirate shipwreck had been discovered and authenticated beyond doubt. Gold and silver glinted in the divers' lights, but there was more: pistols, belt buckles, buttons, and shackles, silent reminders of her origin as a slave ship. Each artifact told a story not just of plunder, but of human lives stolen and lost. The world reeled at the discovery. Museums clamored for relics, newspapers splashed headlines, and Clifford himself became a figure of both fame and controversy. Some hailed him as a hero, others accused him of exploiting a grave. For beneath the treasure lay bones, the skeletal remains of pirates and perhaps of slaves. Their stories buried for centuries, now disturbed by human greed once again. Clifford defended his work. "The Whydah is not just about gold," he said. "She tells the truth about piracy, about slavery, about who we were. This is not a treasure hunt. It is archaeology, and yet every coin lifted from the sea shone like temptation. Every chest cracked open whispered of curses. The Whydah, even in discovery, remained what she had always been: a vessel of contradictions, a ship of wealth and misery, a legend of freedom and bondage, a ghost that would not rest. As divers raised cannons and coins, locals once again whispered of lights on the water, of Maria Hallett's lantern swinging in the storm, of Bellamy's figure watching from the surf. Had the Whydah been found, or had she allowed herself to be found, her curse now loosed upon the modern age? The Whydah Gally had refused to stay buried, and her story, darker and stranger than any tale of gold, was only beginning to be told. The first objects raised from the wreck of the Whydah were not glittering coins or chests of jewels, but something far more haunting: iron shackles, corroded and fused together, still bearing the shape of wrists and ankles that had once been bound inside them. When Barry Clifford's divers brought them to the surface in 1984, the world was stunned into silence. For years, treasure hunters had dreamed of the Whydah as a golden prize, a pirate hoard waiting to be claimed. But those shackles told a deeper truth. Before she was a pirate flagship, the Whydah had been a slaver, and her timbers had echoed with screams long before they rang with pirate songs. More relics followed. Coins by the thousands, Spanish, silver, and gold from the Americas, French and English currency from captured merchantmen, West African trade beads still glinting with faint color despite centuries beneath the sea. Pistols emerged, their barrels corroded but their triggers still recognizable. Cutlasses with blades eaten by salt, and cannonballs stacked in forgotten clusters. Every piece carried the weight of history. Some spoke of freedom seized, others of suffering endured. The most stunning discoveries came in fragments of the men themselves. Bones blackened by centuries under shifting sands surfaced in pieces. A femur here, a skull there. Teeth that still clenched the salt of 1717. Scientists studied them, piecing together the lives of pirates once thought faceless. Many were young, their bones showing signs of malnutrition, hard labor, and wounds from old battles. Some were African, perhaps escaped slaves who had chosen piracy as a life of defiance. Others bore European origins, Sailors driven from their homes by poverty or pressed unwillingly into naval service before fleeing to the Black Flag. On the Whydah, these men had stood together, if only briefly, as equals. Among the relics of piracy were relics of humanity: buttons from coats, a child's shoe perhaps belonging to a captive or a stowaway, tobacco pipes with bite marks from nervous teeth, and fragments of musical instruments that might once have played above the roar of cannon fire. One particularly haunting find was a pocket pistol with a gold-plated handle, still loaded with powder and shot, its owner forever unknown. Another was a piece of fine jewelry, gold locket inscribed with delicate initials, perhaps a stolen keepsake, perhaps a lover's gift carried into death. But the most breathtaking discovery of all was a great barnacle-crusted mass the divers called a concretion, a lump of sand, stone, and corroded metal that, when carefully x-rayed and broken apart, revealed the heart of the Whydah's treasure. Inside lay coins fused together like a single golden brick, rings, chains, and nuggets of raw gold, all preserved in the strangest of coffins. When displayed under museum lights, they glittered like captured starlight, the dreams of pirates frozen in time, yet every display case carried shadows. Next to the glittering coins lay shackles, reminding all who gazed upon them that the Whydah's wealth had been built on chains as much as on courage. The ship's story could not be polished into romance. It was not only a tale of freedom, but also of bondage, of lives destroyed so that gold might be carried in her hold. Visitors who viewed the artifacts often wept. Some marveled at the coins, imagining the roar of pirates dividing loot. Others stared longest at the shackles, the pipes, the shoe, the bones-ordinary things that whispered extraordinary pain. Teachers brought students to see not only the glitter, but also the ghosts. This, one guide whispered in awe, is not just treasure. It is truth. Still, whispers of a curse clung to the Whydah. Divers who disturbed her grave reported strange accidents, equipment failing without reason, storms rising suddenly, lights flickering in underwater gloom. Some claimed to have seen figures in the murk, pale faces watching from behind cannons, chains drifting where no chains should be. One diver surfaced screaming that he had felt hands on him, dragging him down, though no one else was near. Clifford himself laughed at such tales in public, but in private he admitted the ship carried an aura he could not deny. "You feel them down there," he once said quietly. "The men who died, the ones who never got free. You feel them." The artifacts also reignited the legend of Maria Hallett, Bellamy's lover on Cape Cod. Locals said she haunted the dunes still, her lantern swinging in the wind as she searched for her pirate lost in the waves. Some whispered that it was her curse that kept the Whydah buried for so long, her grief anchoring the treasure beneath the sand. And when Clifford's discovery made headlines, stories spread of her ghost wandering near the excavation site, pale and weeping, warning those who dared disturb the wreck. But even curses could not stop the tide of discovery. Over 200,000 individual artifacts were eventually recovered from the Whydah, making her not just the richest pirate wreck ever found, but the most significant archaeological window into the golden age of piracy. For the first time, scholars could move beyond legend into fact. The relics told stories, not of faceless rogues, but of real men who smoked pipes, played fiddles, patched coats, loaded pistols, and carved initials into jewelry. Men who laughed, who fought, who loved, and who drowned, and always, in the background, the sound of chains. Shackles sat beside treasure, a reminder that piracy was born from empire, and empire was built on slavery. The Whydah was both. She had carried chains and she had carried gold. She was a ship of contradictions, her timbers steeped in both freedom and suffering, her wreck a tomb and a treasure chest, even today, when her artifacts gleam under glass in museums. Visitors say the air feels heavy around them, as if unseen eyes still watch. Some swear they hear faint whispers in the galleries, the echo of waves and cries carried from 3 centuries ago. Children grow quiet before the shackles. Adults linger too long before the bones. The Whydah does not let her story be consumed without consequence, because she is not finished. The wreck still lies beneath the waves, much of her treasure still buried in sand. Each storm shifts the seabed, revealing fragments, hiding others. The sea gives and the sea takes, and the Whydah remains caught between. To this day, treasure hunters and scholars alike continue to search, driven by both greed and curiosity, haunted by both riches and ghosts. And the question lingers, was she found or did she allow herself to be found? Her curse rising again in the modern world. The moment Barry Clifford's team announced they had found the Whydah Gally in 1984, the quiet fishing towns of Cape Cod were transformed into battlegrounds. For centuries, the wreck had been whispered about in taverns and around fires, a myth haunting the sands. Now it was real, her relics shimmering under glass. And the world came running, historians, journalists, museums, investors, and treasure hunters all hungry to stake a claim on the ghost ship's fortune. Clifford had dreamed of discovery, but he had awakened a storm. At first, it was celebration. Newspapers screamed headlines about the world's only authenticated pirate shipwreck. Reporters flocked to Wellfleet, their cameras trained on divers dragging barnacle-crusted cannons out of the surf. Clifford stood in the spotlight, sunburned and grinning, declaring, "This is history, not just treasure." Children pressed their faces against glass to see coins fused by seawater into golden lumps. Tourists poured into the Cape, spending money in shops and taverns, eager to hear ghost stories told with fresh fire. But beneath the excitement, darker currents churned. The state of Massachusetts quickly stepped in, declaring that the wreck belonged not to Clifford but to the people, protected under state waters. Lawsuits erupted, lawyers swarming like gulls over a whale carcass. Clifford fought back, arguing that he had found the wreck through his own labor, that treasure hunters through history had always claimed rights to their discoveries. The courts became his new battlefield, the black flag replaced by stacks of legal documents. Meanwhile, archaeologists and historians bristled at Clifford's methods. To them, every coin, every button, every shard of timber was not just treasure, but evidence fragments of lives that told stories beyond plunder. They feared Clifford was a profiteer, more interested in gold than truth. Clifford insisted he was preserving history, but critics muttered that he was a showman, selling tickets to exhibitions while priceless knowledge slipped through greedy fingers. The debate grew fiercer when bones were found. Human remains, tangled with chains and weapons, lay among the wreckage. Were they pirates, enslaved Africans, or both? Scientists demanded reverence, rituals, careful study. Locals whispered of curses, claiming storms rose whenever the bones were disturbed. Clifford pressed on, determined to recover all that the sea would yield. The Whydah had not been at peace for centuries, and now she was torn between science, commerce, and superstition. For the people of Cape Cod, the Whydah's discovery was both blessing and curse. On one hand, It brought prosperity. Tourists flocked to the Whydah Museum, eager to see gold coins, pistols, and shackles laid side by side under the glow of exhibit lights. On the other, it stirred old ghosts. Families who traced their lineage back to the Puritan settlers whispered that Maria Hallett, the so-called Witch of Wellfleet, was restless again. Her lantern, some said, had been seen in the dunes since the first artifacts were raised, her ghost pacing as if guarding the grave of her lost lover. Black Sam Bellamy. Clifford himself became as much a figure of legend as Bellamy. To some, he was a hero, a modern pirate who had wrested history from the sea. To others, he was a villain, disturbing the dead for profit. In interviews, he often compared himself to Bellamy, claiming he too had defied authority, had risked everything for freedom and discovery. His critics muttered that he had also inherited Bellamy's curse. Conflicts raged not just in courtrooms but in taverns, on docks, in the hearts of those who stared at the relics. Was the Whydah a treasure or a tomb, a museum or a mausoleum? Every answer seemed to betray part of her truth, and all the while more artifacts emerged. Coins by the bucket, cannons by the dozen, rings, beads, pistols, buckles. Each new discovery reignited the battle. Clifford wanted to display them to the public, to inspire awe. Scholars wanted them studied in labs, catalogued with precision. Locals wanted them left where they were, untouched, lest the ghosts grow angrier. The clash reached fever pitch when Clifford announced plans to display the treasure worldwide, to take the Whydah on tour like a carnival of gold and bones. Critics accused him of turning tragedy into entertainment. He fired back that history belonged to everyone, not just to ivory tower academics. Crowds still lined up, wallets open, eyes wide, hungry for a taste of pirate glory. But beneath the glitter, unease spread. Strange accidents plagued the divers. One was struck by falling debris underwater. His helmet cracked, but his life spared by inches. Another swore he saw a figure floating in the murk beside him, chains dragging across the seabed, though no diver was near. Equipment failed at crucial moments. Storms rose without warning. And more than once the team returned empty-handed from dives where sonar had promised treasure. Even Clifford admitted, late at night, that the Whydah seemed alive. "It's as if she chooses what to give up," he told a reporter. "As if she decides when she's ready to show us something." And what she showed was often unsettling. Alongside glittering coins came children's shoes, rusted shackles, fragments of bones with musket balls still lodged in them. The Whydah refused to be only a pirate legend. She forced her story to remain one of slavery, of suffering, of ordinary men caught in extraordinary tides. By the late 1990s, the lawsuits settled in Clifford's favor. He retained rights to the wreck, though under the watchful eye of historians and the state. The Whydah Museum became permanent, her artifacts displayed not just as treasure, but as testimony. Clifford called her the ship that tells the truth, though he admitted that truth came at a price. The Whydah had given him fame, but also enemies, sleepless nights, and the eerie sense that he was not the only one watching over her relics. Still, the battles raged. Some argued that the artifacts should be repatriated, returned to Africa as acknowledgement of the ship's origins as a slaver. Others demanded they remain in Massachusetts, part of local heritage. Treasure hunters still whispered of coins yet undiscovered, of chests deeper than Clifford's team had reached. And in every argument, the ghosts of the Whydah seemed to stir, restless, unquiet, unwilling to be reduced to any single narrative. On stormy nights, When the surf pounds the Cape Cod beaches, locals still swear they hear the sound of timbers cracking, of men screaming, of Maria Hallett's lantern swinging in the mist. Some say Bellamy himself is out there, his figure walking the shoreline, his eyes black as the sea, waiting for the day when the Whydah will finally rise again. The battles on shore proved one thing. The Whydah had never been just a ship. She was a mirror, reflecting greed, freedom, suffering, love, and legend. Those who touched her became part of her story, whether they wished to or not. And her story was not finished, because even as museums filled with her artifacts and scholars wrote her history, rumors grew that more treasure still lay hidden, untouched, deep beneath the shifting sands. Gold that no diver had yet seen. Secrets the Whydah was not ready to reveal, and perhaps secrets she never would. Long after the lawsuits quieted and the museum lights dimmed, the Whydah remained restless. She had been pulled from her sandy tomb, displayed in glass and steel, but the sea had not forgotten. Each year storms clawed at Cape Cod, stirring her timbers, scattering her coins, reshaping her grave. Divers returned season after season, still uncovering fragments, a buckle here, a musket there, another concretion cracked open to reveal coins fused by salt into molten lumps of history. It was as if the Whydah had no end, as if she parceled out her story piece by piece, never yielding all at once. Barry Clifford became her keeper, but also her captive. He had thought discovery would satisfy him, yet the Whydah consumed him instead. Every dive was a new obsession. Every artifact raised was a question that demanded another answer. He told reporters he was preserving history, but friends whispered he had become like the pirates themselves, unable to stop chasing gold even as it dragged him deeper. "The Whydah owns me," he admitted once. A smile on his lips, but shadows in his eyes. The ship's dual legacy gnawed at everyone who touched it. On one hand, she was a pirate legend, the richest wreck ever found. Proof that Black Sam Bellamy had been real, his hoard glittering as bright as the songs sung about him. On the other, she was a slaver, her chains just as real, her bones just as telling, her story darker than any romantic ballad dared confess. To schoolchildren, she was adventure. To scholars, she was contradiction. To the locals of Wellfleet, she was both curse and pride. But perhaps most unsettling was the way the Whydah refused to stay still. Visitors to the museums swore they felt watched. Guards reported alarms triggered when no one was near the exhibits. One night, during a storm, a security camera caught what appeared to be a flicker of lantern light moving among the displays, though no lantern existed inside. Workers cleaning the cases said they sometimes heard faint sounds chains dragging, waves crashing, even laughter echoing in the glass. They told each other to shake it off, but they avoided working alone near the shackles. On the beaches, the legends deepened. Fishermen spoke of seeing a ship appear in the mist, sails tattered, lanterns glowing faintly, only to vanish when approached. Children dared each other to walk the dunes at night, listening for Maria Hallett's voice calling to Bellamy. One old woman swore she saw the pirate himself standing on the shore, dripping seawater, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if still searching for his lost bride. "The sea remembers," they whispered, "and the Whydah will not let her dead go quietly." Yet despite the ghost stories, the Whydah brought truth as much as terror. Archaeologists used her relics to rewrite the story of piracy, showing the daily lives of men once caricatured as monsters or clowns. They discovered that pirates were skilled sailors, armed to the teeth, and often more democratic than the governments they opposed. They showed how men from Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe stood side by side on her decks, carving out brief moments of equality in a world ruled by kings and chains. They proved that the Whydah was not just about gold, it was about freedom, about rebellion, about human choices in the face of empire. Still, the treasure called. Not all of it has been found. Clifford's team estimates that much remains buried under shifting sands, waiting in silence. Each storm uncovers a little more, hints at greater chests, deeper still. Divers dive, storms rage, and the Whydah endures. She has outlasted the men who built her, the pirates who sailed her, and perhaps she will outlast us too. And so the Whydah remains what she always was, a paradox, a ship of chains and a ship of freedom, a tomb and a treasure, a legend and a truth. The sea remembers her, the shore remembers her, and now the world remembers her too. But perhaps memory is her cursed, she cannot rest, that her story will be told and retold until the waves themselves stop moving. Some say that when the last coin is finally raised, when the last shackle is placed under glass, the Whydah will at last be silent. Others believe she will never yield fully, that Bellamy and his crew will guard their gold forever, their ghosts still pacing her decks beneath the waves. And maybe that is the final truth, that the Whydah will never belong to one man, one museum, one story. She belongs to the sea, and the sea never forgets. For centuries, the Whydah Gally was called a pirate ship, a treasure wreck, a golden tomb. But the final twist of her story is that she was never just one thing. She was born in chains, raised on blood money, reborn under the black flag, drowned in fury, and rediscovered as both hoard and grave. Every artifact raised, every coin, every pistol, every shackle is a mirror. They reflect not only pirates, but us, because the Whydah forces us to ask, what do we value more, the glitter of gold, or the truth of suffering that paid for it? Do we chase legends because we love freedom, or because we're blinded by greed? Just like those men who loaded her until she sank. And maybe, just maybe, the real curse of the Whydah is not in storms or ghosts, but in the fact that she still tempts us today. Divers say much of her treasure still sleeps beneath Cape Cod's shifting sands, and the sea decides when, or if, it will be revealed. Some whisper that Bellamy still walks the shoreline, searching for his lost love Maria Hallett, lanterns flickering in the mist. Others say the Whydah is a lesson, her timbers whispering across 3 centuries that wealth without humanity is nothing but chains. So when you look at a gold coin from the Whydah, gleaming under museum glass, remember this, it is not just treasure, it is a ghost, and the ghost is staring back. If you thought this tale was wild, wait until you hear the next untold pirate story, another legend of the sea, darker, stranger, and more haunting than the last. Subscribe and join me on the next voyage into the shadows of history.